Joining us now via Skype from New Mexico is Dave Marash. Now, people will recognize him as a former anchor and journalist for Al Jazeera. With me in the studio, Faisal Al Shammeri. He is a political analyst and columnist for Al-Arabiya and other Saudi Arabian newspapers. And from Boston, we have Kaveh Afrasiabi. He is a political scientist and author of the upcoming book, The Iran Nuclear Accord and the Remaking of the Middle East. We also have Tawfik Hamid. He's an Islamic thinker and reformer, and one-time Islamic extremist from Egypt here in the studio. Dave Marash, let's start with you. You used to work for Al Jazeera, Qatar's jewel in the media, in its media empire. What's the feeling on the ground there now this crisis is in its second week? And what's going to happen, do you think?
Well, I can only extrapolate because I'm not there, so I don't know what the feeling on the ground is.
You have lots of friends there, I'm sure.
You know, I'm sure that many people in Qatar feel very vulnerable. It's a tiny state. It is surrounded on all sides now by people who are, or states that are part of this boycott. Getting in and out of Qatar is difficult. There are a limited number of air routes that the Qatari airline is allowed to use. And ironically, given that, as you pointed out earlier, one of the main focuses of this pressure is to break Qatar's relations with Iran, but the closing down of air routes over Bahrain and Saudi Arabia have forced Qatar Air to fly almost exclusively over Iran. And of course, they can't do that without Iran's by your leave, so that the first effect of the shutting down of air routes in and out of Qatar has been to make Qatar not less dependent or independent of Iran, but more dependent on Iran. And what I think everybody worries about is more and more unforeseen secondary consequences of this action, like the Turks moving a foreign ministry visitor tomorrow. They have mentioned that Turkish troops might go to Qatar as kind of canaries in the coal mine. The Saudis have responded to that by saying that they might be more willing to arm the Kurdish troops in Syria, so that the ramifications of this across the region are very, very great.
Well, we'll delve into those as the show goes on. Faisal, I just want to ask you this question. Why did Saudi Arabia feel it had to do this now?
First of all, we have to understand that the situation is not based on today or based on the posting of the Qatari press agency. The situation between these Gulf countries plus Egypt and Qatar been going on since 1995. Since the establishment of Al Jazeera network and certain events after that. So the reaction of the Gulf country and Egypt is reflection on the behavior of Qatar for the past 20 years.
Tawfik, I want to bring in the Egyptian perspective here, because as Faisal just said, you know, it's not just Saudi Arabia, Egypt hand in hand. And we saw, you know, Donald Trump in the region with both those leaders next to him. Did they feel emboldened? And what's Egypt's game in this? Is it purely the Muslim Brotherhood and Qatar's connection to them?
I believe the Egyptian regimes and actually the Egyptian people realized that the involvement of Qatar in the area was a form of support for terrorism in their nations, which could actually or can actually bring Egypt into a state of chaos at the end. So I believe the Egyptians in general and their leadership are very caring about ending this support for terrorism. And that's why they are fully supportive of what President Trump is trying to do now.
When you say terrorism, do you mean the Muslim Brotherhood?
I mean several groups, like through the Muslim Brotherhood, support could be for ISIS, but I can't imagine that the US President and his Secretary of State standing in front of the whole world and saying clearly and unambiguously that Qatar support violent groups and terrorism, if they do not have concrete and solid evidence they can build these words upon. So what I'm saying is to have the US president saying it that explicit and to have Mr. Tillerson saying it in the same way I believe they have strong evidence in front of them. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been able to speak with this confidence.
Watch out with Donald Trump and evidence and statements. It doesn't always line up. But Kaveh, I just want to bring in you. Qatar, obviously accused of terrorism, but as Sean said in the outset there, really support for Iran is a lot behind the tensions, or not support, at least communication with Iran and trade links. What's Iran's response been? I see they're sending in food. Is this an opportunity in a way for Iran to grow its influence within the Gulf?
Well, Iran has reacted with prudence and cautiously, and as your reporter said, has been sending some food to Qatar that is heavily dependent on food import and is now fighting for its survival and independence against illegal pressure sandwiched between these neighbors that are using these cheap excuses, rationalizations, in order to turn Qatar from an independent regional player into a satellite state for Saudi Arabia. And we heard from the Qatari foreign minister saying that the Saudis want to assume guardianship over Qatar, and it's obviously not acceptable to the Qatari population. Unfortunately, Qatar is a very cohesive society that has a history of standing up to Saudi bullying, and there's no doubt that they will prevail in this round as well. And all these pressures, illegal pressures by Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Bahrain will backfire. And this thing is headed toward the United Nations Security Council, in my opinion, because the Saudis are in violation, the Bahrainis and the UAE, of the international aviation law.
That's a good point. One point you just raised, I want to bring to Dave Marash, which is that there is a long history here. Dave, obviously, we don't have a long show, but this is really a long simmering dispute, isn't it? Because as was just previously said, Qatar for a long time was in the shadow of Saudi Arabia, but then broke out. What happened?
Well, when Qatar established Al Jazeera, it established a voice and a vision of Middle Eastern Islam that was at odds with the Saudi vision. They really both had two different kinds of Sunni Islam in mind. Qatar has been much more in favor of a modernizing, in many ways democratizing Islam, whereas the Saudi version is the traditional Wahhabi version, very authoritarian and very much fundamentalist in its connection to the first centuries of Islamic belief. Now, of course, to have the Saudis criticizing Qatar for supporting terrorists is very ironic because the Saudis themselves support terrorists. So the real conflict here is about which terrorists each side is supporting. And Qatar has traditionally been tied to the Muslim Brotherhood, which regarded itself as a more modernizing 21st century kind of Islam than the Wahhabi fundamentalists. And of course, the crucible of difference there was Egypt, where Qatar very enthusiastically supported the Muslim Brotherhood government, and the Saudis supported the Egyptian military that overthrew the Muslim Brotherhood government. Al Jazeera actually did itself a lot of damage by forsaking what had been a very well-established tradition of objective news reporting, and through its support, and in fact created a separate channel that consistently supported the Muslim Brotherhood government in Egypt.
Dave, thanks for that.